Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Octopus Builds, where we are building out the Trident project for the fictional company Octo Pet Shop. Now, in the last episode, we set up a couple of things that I wanted to talk a little bit more about. The first thing is we configured guided failures within the project. And what this does is it allows the system to come in, and if there's any sort of error that occurs during a deployment, it will actually pause the deployment and wait for the some sort of human to come in and either like retry a step or ignore the step or ignore the machine or fail the deployment. So there's a number of different options on something along those lines. But when we set this up, we did a couple of additional things because it made a lot of sense at that time. Namely, we set up this new channel called Dev QA, which has Dev and QA, aptly named. Now, let's talk a little bit about branching strategies within source control. And if you're not familiar with this, with the advent of distributed version control systems, specifically Git, creating branches became a very, very easy thing to do. I came from the world of TFS, where creating a branch was a very heavy operation where it actually cloned everything, and there's a lot of database work involved. I also used SVN in the past, as well as Visual Source Safe. So I managed to, with Visual Source Safe and TFS, I managed to hit the heavy branch creation process, and so branching wasn't really an option. But with Git, branching is infinitely easier. Just the way that it creates branches, the way you can destroy branches, they've made the maintainers of Git have made that much easier. Because of that, we have to have discussions around branching strategies. One of the more popular branching strategies that are out there that we'll typically run into is folks are very interested in using Git flow. Now, I pulled this image off of Atlassian's website, and if you're not familiar with Git flow, it is a rather complex branching strategy that is hard to kind of wrap your head around, because what you end up having is you end up having two long living branches. You have a main branch, and then you have a development branch. And what you have is you have periodic merges into the main branch anytime you want to create any sort of release. So this is the main branch, and then from there is branched off as the dev branch. And then these are individual feature branches, the work that's happening. And so here a feature branch was created from dev, and then the work was done, and then that was merged back into dev, and then we created a release for that. And then that work was then merged up to the main branch, and then we also had any sort of work that was in the main branch that was merged there, and then so on and so forth. So there's a lot of merging going on. There's a lot of different things that are going on, a lot of branches to keep clear in your head, and it's kind of hard to understand. Now, fortunately for us, the dev team working on Trident has decided to implement, instead of this, what's known as a trunk-based branching strategy. And so I created this up in Whimsical, and basically how it works is we do not have a development branch. Everything is deployed from main, and everything is branched from main. So in this case, we have the main branch, and then we have our first feature branch that is created, and then we have any sort of commits that are occurring. So as the developers are doing work, they're checking in their changes and they're committing it, and then they merge that into the main branch, and then we would have a release from here. And at that point, we'd create a second feature branch if we had another feature we wanted to start working on at that point, and then we'd repeat that cycle. But after you deploy that main release, you might encounter some sort of bug or some sort of indication where you need to make a hotfix. So then you'd create that hotfix branch, do the necessary work you need to do there, and then you merge that into main. At no point are you checking directly into main, because again, we have that branch protection policy that's in place. So everything is occurring via merges or pull requests in that particular sense. Now, once this is merged into main, then we have another deployment that's is kicked off from here, and then once this feature work is done, we'd have another deployment to production from here. So that is in general what the idea is. Now, in talking to the developers, they made a very interesting observation. What they would love to have is the ability where they could deploy from these feature branches. Because this particular team, the Trident team, does not have a lot of developers. They only have 4 developers plus a lead dev. And most of the time, there might be one feature branch in flight when one hotfix branch in flight at any given point in time, depending on prioritization and everything along those lines. So while features are being worked on, they would love to be able to deploy that. Now, if we look back at our Trident project and we focus in on the channel default, this is coming in from the main branch. And so we have dev, QA, staging, and production. And what that means, if we go back to our branching strategy, is we'd have to periodically merge unfinished code into main in order for that deployment to happen. That is not optimal. At the same time, once a merge occurs in main, we want to get that to production relatively quickly. We don't want to have changes that are in the main branch that are not in production for very long. It could be for a hotfix region, or it could be for a whole new feature. But either way, we want to make sure that it gets up to production rather quickly. So again, if we look back here, we do have those mechanisms. We have the hotfix branch, the hotfix channel, and then we have this dev QA. So what they asked, and it makes a ton of sense with what they're asking, they want to change around the default channel to have that only go to dev and QA. And what they're planning on doing is they're going to update the build server that if there's any sort of feature branch work, it will automatically get deployed to dev and QA. It will create the appropriate, it doesn't have to do any sort of thinking, but it will select the default channel. So let's go ahead and let's change our channels around a little bit. So the default lifecycle is currently inherits from the project. Let's change the default lifecycle in the project. So let's change this to the dev test lifecycle. So now we have development and QA. If we come back to overview, that's what we're going to see, dev and QA. At the same time, we want the channel called hotfix. We want to change that to now be called release. And we're going to have keep the same hotfix channel. Should be used for deployments from the main branch to production, because we want to make sure people are aware of what's going to happen. Let's also change around the default lifecycle. Let's change this around, and this is going to be the default channel should be used for feature branch work. Now we're going to do a couple of things to make sure that we're following all the necessary rules. So in talking with the developers, they made one big change, which is for any build that comes from a feature branch, they're going to add a pre-release tag. So what does a pre-release tag look like? So this is what a pre-release tag looks like. It's the version number, and then once you add this hyphen and then multiple instances, that indicates that there's a pre-release tag that's happening. So what that's saying is that this package is not ready to go to production yet. So let's go ahead, let's go back to, I was going to show the documentation in just a little bit. Let's go back to our channels really quick. And what we want to do here is let's go ahead and let's add in a version rule for our package, and we require a pre-release tag. So let's go ahead and let's copy in. So we can say matches any pre-release tag. So this requires a pre-release tag. So the only way to get something into this channel, the package has to have a pre-release tag. Now let's go back to the other channels and let's look at release. So this requires a certain version range. Now that could be fairly applicable, but that doesn't scale all that well because we're going to be constantly coming back here and changing it. And the developers, we know that the main branch has the branch protection policy that we set up in a previous episode using the config as code feature. So we know that everything has to have a pull request. And so by the time something gets into main, it has probably passed QA, it has passed at least someone's eyes, so it's ready to go out to staging. We don't need to have that degree of control. Instead, what we want to do is we only want to include releases for packages without a pre-release tag. So let's pop this over. So it will not accept this version. We can also do something like this where, we want to make sure it's at least on a certain version, like version 1. That way, if there's we release a big version 2 or something like that, we can 1.0 to, actually, you know what? Let's do to 2.0. And so we don't have any of these, like 0.1 releases are allowed. But if I were to come in here and I were to say, hey, now we're ready to do 2.1 something, that wouldn't be allowed because we want to have a pretty big version range. If we want to do something like this might be a little bit extra control. I think just not having a pre-release tag is pretty good control, but again, it also depends on your particular setup. All right, so we've made a couple of changes. The last thing we want to do is I kind of want to get rid of this dev QA channel. It's kind of redundant. So let's go ahead and let's just, you probably don't want to delete the release. What we can do is we can edit this and we can change this to be the default, and it will say it's only applicable, it's not liking certain things, and that's fine. You can only do that in very specific cases, and I happen to meet the very specific case. Cannot be deployed to the development environment. Why can't you be deployed? That's weird. Yeah, you can. That was a weird message. I don't know why it said that. But anyway, we don't have any releases in our dev QA channel, so let's go ahead and let's just get rid of that because it's just redundant at this point. So let's just delete this. All right. So now what we have is we have dev and QA, and so what will happen is as feature branches are being worked on, they'll be deployed and they can be going from dev and QA, which is great. That's exactly what we want to have happen. And then once everyone looks good, once we get a sign off, QA signs off, everything looks good, then we can do the pull request and merge that into main. That will trigger a whole new build, and then it will trigger a deployment to our release channel for staging and production. Now you might be asking yourself, why are we going to have a whole new build in this particular point? That's because of this scenario. So we might have had a hotfix that goes out and it might have changed the main branch at some point. Well, when we merge this in, this is a wholly different set of code than what's in this particular commit. So it's very important that we redo a build and we push that out because that is what we need to finally test in our staging environment. Now we have a legitimate reason why we have a staging environment, because we are prepping. This is the final place for that deployment to occur before we go out to production. Because because production and main are so closely linked together in this particular case, we feel pretty confident going directly to staging. We can maybe change that in the future if we want to, but for now, this is going to be our pipeline going forward. So do a feature branch, do development and QA, and in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm even going to rename this, and we can do that just to match this up, just so people know what's happening. So version 1.2, I'm going to say multiple instances. So that way, when we look at it into development, we can see exactly, okay, we know dev and QA, and so when we go to QA, and then when we look at our overall dashboard, we can see what's going on. So again, we have everything kind of working together at this particular point. So yes, we are matching, by doing this, we're matching our branching strategy. And this is a branching strategy that should work for for quite a significant amount of time. And this also will work for a great deal of time for Octopus deploy. And that is really it for this particular episode. I hope you got some value out of it. It is a little bit different. It's kind of a little bit more heady when we're talking about branching strategies. Look forward to the next video. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.